I'm guest hosting. A member of Fuel Poverty Action as well. But I thank you for giving me this space today. Today's meeting is for Fuel Poverty Action series of monthly learning lessons, Fuel for Thought, from fuel poverty to climate action. Uh, Fuel Poverty Action is a group of ordinary people fed up with being robbed by the energy industry through spiraling bills and rip-off prepayment meters. We campaign, set people from fuel poverty, challenge rip-off energy companies' unfair policies, leaving people in cold homes, and we take action on warm, well-insulated homes, clean and affordable energy, and under the control of people and communities, not private companies. And this really links to this session because it's about the false solutions which are going to cost a lot and have various other terrible impacts. So yeah, it's a special session, I think. It's a space to share research and lived experience, tackle lies and clear up confusion on fuel poverty and climate change. So we ask and answer and discuss questions with experts, activists, and campaigners. Okay, so that said, time to move on to our first speaker. So, first speaker, Andrew Boswell, Dr. Andrew Boswell was the Green Party councillor, energy expert. Campaigns against the government's carbon and capture and storage (CCS) plans. He's going to talk us through what CCS is, why it may be a costly failure, and why it will keep energy bills high, and his legal case, which, if you're around in London, you might want to support. I'm sure he'll explain. So, over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Lee and Amal. I hope you can see the screen okay.
Yep, I can.
So I'm just going to go very quickly cover a few points on carbon capture and storage. Essentially, first of all, what is it? It is what it basically says. It's capturing carbon and then trying to store it. I'll say trying because it's a very difficult process, either under the sea or under land. So what are you capturing the carbon from? Typically, it's from something you're burning, burning fossil fuels or burning wood, as in Drax. I'll leave Sally to cover that, or industrial processes. Now, the industrial processes might be things like waste incineration or cement or steel production, though already there's better ways of making steel than using CCS. That's fairly much the way things are going, is towards electrification for steel production now. I've highlighted natural gas there because I'm not necessarily completely opposed to all CCS. There might possibly be usages in some industrial processes like cement, for example. However, what I'm really focused on is burning fossil fuels, and that means in the UK burning gas, natural gas. You also hear CCUS, which is just carbon usage and storage, and also, of course, BECCS, which is Drax, but I won't go into those more now. So here we are on October the 4th, and the Prime Minister announced 22 billion for carbon capture and storage. But what's important to know about that is that that is not just some project which came out of the new government as some sort of clever way to meet net zero or something, which is what is being sort of put out as, but it's actually.
Sorry, Andrew. Can I just
Yeah,
say, when you turn away from your computer, the sound is dropping out. So
sorry
just be
about that.
careful.
Yeah,
No,
I'll try and speak at the mic. I know the mic on this computer is a bit sensitive. So that's actually a Tory project going back to 2018. The Tories started developing what they call carbon capture usage and storage around clusters. I'll talk about slightly in a moment. And basically, the Labour government didn't change the Tory policy at all. They actually put more money into it. That was the only difference. And essentially, the government, the UK government, both Tory and Labour, have been caught by the fossil fuel industry. and I'll just put a link into the chat on that. I've got various links I can put in, but this is on the lobbying before that decision. Okay.
I just while you're waiting, I just stuck in a Guardian article that's by David Edson saying why the Labour Party is a Tory party and should believe that they're saying.
Yeah, yeah. So where is this happening in the UK? The first two projects, the government call these Track One, are in near Liverpool and on Teesside. And Teesside is the one I'm in the court, and I'll come on to that later. There's also a Track Two, which is Acorn in Scotland and Humberside. And of course, Drax comes under the Humberside one. And then there's talks of other ones in Norfolk, near Southampton, also South Wales. What's the overall cost to the consumer and taxpayer? Well, that 22 billion isn't all of it. Um, in, on December the 10th, the government made the first subsidy award to CCUS in the UK, and it was 10 billion pounds of subsidy for Net Zero Teesside. Net Zero Teesside is a gas-fired power station with CCS added to it. And they also at the same day 7 billion for CO2 storage under Teesside. And I think it's worth actually looking at the subsidies on the government subsidy website. I'll just bring that up quickly. Everybody see that. That you actually have 60 million, um, 60 billion subsidies for CCS now assigned. So that's for industrial carbon capture and storage, that first one I've highlighted. This is the
Are
waste
you showing? This
incineration.
is not showing, Andrew. If you put the
Is that
link
not
in the chat,
showing?
that
Sorry.
no, put the link in the chat. That might help. If you're using a website,
Yeah, I'll do that.
because
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay. I'll put the link in. Are you still seeing the PowerPoint slide then?
yes, yeah, it's on
Okay.
consumer taxpayer cost.
It didn't switch
No,
from the PowerPoint slide over to the website page. Okay, well, what I was pointing out was as well as that 17 billion they put in on December the 10th, there's up to 60 billion for carbon capture and storage. That's the web page, and I've just put that in to the chat. So a number of MPs on the Public Accounts Committee, and that's a very high profile committee in Westminster, warned earlier this month a number of things about CCS. They looked at it in quite a lot of detail. I think these are really relevant to the cost for consumer bills and so on. First of all, they said CCS is a high risk investment. It's not necessarily going to deliver on net zero, and it's not necessarily even going to work. Um, there's 34 billion of contingent liabilities assigned. Now that is actually if any of these schemes like the one at Teesside fail, don't come to fruition, the government are actually going to bail out the companies. So the companies are not even prepared to take the risk. They're putting that risk has been put onto the government. There'll be more about that shortly in the media and things. There's a very high cost, and it's split a quarter to the taxpayer and quarters to levies on consumer bills. That's how that 60 billion of potential subsidies, the money's generated from taxes and from consumer bills. And energy bills will remain linked to the gas market. And we know that the reason for high energy bills at the moment is that the war in Ukraine and afterwards, very highly volatile gas prices that put on to consumer bills. And that will remain high if we go down the CCS route. And that's what these MPs were saying. And effectively, the public is paying billions on their bills for a technology with no guarantee of success. So who do those billions go to? These are the companies involved. They're the sort of household names as fossil fuel companies. BP, excuse me, and the Norwegian Equinor are very big in this. Equinor have already done quite a lot on CCS in Norway. BP and Equinor are behind Net Zero Teesside. With the French company Total Energies, they're they're behind the CO2 storage at Teesside, off in the North Sea, off the north coast. Um, the Indian company ESOR is behind a blue hydrogen plant at HyNet, and an Italian company, Eni, is behind the CO2 storage in Liverpool Bay. Critically, and this is what the MP's report also highlighted, none of the billions come back to consumers or taxpayers. So even if carbon capture and storage was completely successful, according to the way the government say, that there's not going to be any payback to consumers or taxpayers. So it's all funded up front, no payback later. So why is it not a good thing? Um, from a climate point of view, it enables fossil fuel industry just to keep extracting and using fossil fuels. And the climate impacts are severely underestimated in all the government work. And that's where my legal case comes in. I'll just touch on that in a moment. But basically, quite often they leak CO2 because the pipe may be down going out to the sea, or they need to be maintaining it. Though the emissions from those outages have not been included. The upstream emissions, and this is where the natural gas bit comes in very important. The upstream emissions from natural gas basically have a lot of methane leakage in them, and that's whether they're from the UK basin or elsewhere. And those methane emissions have not been accounted correctly. But when they're for elsewhere, for example, liquefied natural gas from the United States, for example, fracking in Texas, that sort of thing, then the methane emissions are really, really high, really climate damaging. And also the carbon capture rate has been overestimated. There's no commercial systems operating at the rates these companies are saying they will deliver them at. I'm not sure where I am on time, but I'll just very quickly go through this. Um, Hydrogen, when it's talking about blue hydrogen, is not needed at the scale projected. Hydrogen's basically a bubble which has been over rated. Um, the job wash, there's lots of claims about the job CCS will, obviously jobs in insulation or developing renewables, be just as many jobs created that way, better jobs. We need energy transition. And also, the both blue hydrogen and gas CCS have not been identified as being needed to get to the clean power target of 2030. So there's a big question mark really about why develop them now anyway, when we could be developing renewables, energy storage and insulation, and we can that's going to help us better achieve our energy climate targets, lower bills and warmer homes. So just to talk about my case, as I said, that's against the gas-fired power station at Teesside. It's based upon the fact that the carbon emissions have been underestimated, but even when the government accepted that, they found that there's very high emissions anyway, even before the underestimate. But despite that, they said they're consistent with net zero. And the crux of the case is whether they were able to claim that it was consistent with net zero with those very high emissions. It's a test case on CCS in the UK, where it's on the March 4th and 5th. If you want to join for hear the court hearing, I'd recommend people do find out how climate litigation works and so on, how we're challenging the government on this sort of thing. Join us at 9:45 outside the courts on March the 4th. Well, we have a rally on March the 4th, 12:30 for 1 o'clock, and lots of speeches. We've got about 10 speakers so far lined up for that rally. I'm sure I've gone over time, so I'll finish now. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, if you can make it, get down there. It'd uh, be interesting. I don't know whether you mentioned this, but it is also just an excuse to keep the fossil fuel industry keeping going. There are a number of papers that have been written
Absolutely.
about this, that we shouldn't use carbon capture and storage before we end fossil fuels, because it's just a license to continue, and that's one of the main problems.
Yeah.
Uh, okay, so we'll come on to our next speaker, which is Sam, uh, former policy officer covering sustainability for PCS trade union, vice chair of the campaign for nuclear disarmament. Over to you, Sam.
Thanks, Lee. Yeah, and thanks for the invite to come and contribute to this session. And great to hear from you, Andrew. And I think I'm going to kind of start off in a bit of a similar vein from the point of view of the current Labour policy is really following on, and I'm talking about nuclear, but really following on from the Tories and what they had set in train under their terms of office. Now, I think everybody's come across the announcement on the 6th of February as part of Keir Starmer's quest to put builders, not blockers, in place, and this whole attack on sort of NIMBYism and ripping up the planning laws to go ahead and build more nuclear. And there is a consultation document out on that at the moment. And I think most of us actually extremely alarmed by that for a number of reasons, even if you do agree with nuclear power as being part of the energy mix and crucial to climate change objectives. There are a number of reasons to oppose that. I mean, one, obviously, just because of the dangers of nuclear power, its waste and its legacy and everything else. And I think, just to be clear for those people who may not have looked at the actual consultation, what it's about moving from obviously large base nuclear power plants, which are in the Tories' civil nuclear roadmap to 2050, which they launched in January 2024, which committed to building a further large-scale reactors, delivering 3 to 7 gigawatts more nuclear power every 5 years. Now, if you want to put that in perspective, Hinkley C in Somerset is around 3.2 gigawatts and is already running over time and schedule, and costs. So, this is ludicrous anyway, but this new ripping out of the planning laws is really being able to cite nuclear and particularly new technology in terms of nuclear and what they call small modular reactors or advanced modular reactors around the country. So moving away just the 8 sites that were identified previously to really anywhere in the country, and linked to, I know part of the consultation is looking about not being near sort of heavily populated sites, but I think that's going to be highly questionable, because when you look at the intentions to use nuclear around district heat networks, powering up AI, and this is part of the big drive. And I think in all these questions, I think we have to ask, what is the real driver and motivation for these as policy initiatives, in particularly around the decarbonisation agenda? And I think Andrew's touched on one in terms of CCS, and I think Lee, you may have said it about perpetuating the fossil fuel industry around carbon capture. And I think with nuclear, we really have to ask. Nuclear's been on the decline globally for the past few decades. We could actually be fully out of nuclear in the UK by the mid-2030s. We don't need to build new nuclear. It's horrendously expensive. It does take an enormous amount of time to come on board. And I think we've already seen these massive cost overruns with Hinkley Point C. So the next big reactor project underway is Sizewell C, which doesn't have a final investment decision yet. But I think one of the key things, and particularly for energy and fuel poverty campaigners is the new financing models that were brought in for Sizewell C. So the government's already put in near towards up to 10 billion seed funding. Not all of that's been committed yet, but or spent, but it's certainly been committed. But because of the difficulties in getting private investment into there, they brought in a new Finance Act a couple of years ago, and the regulated asset-based model for financing nuclear project. Now that puts all the risk up front onto taxpayers and consumers, and energy bills. So we would be seeing a levy on our energy bills to pay for that. I mean, that is quite a common model which is used in other infrastructure projects, but I think this is very concerning in terms of nuclear as well, because we've already, even in Hinkley, with the strike price that they got for the cost of the nuclear power at Hinkley, would already see big increases onto our energy bill. So I think when we see all these statements thrown out that, this is going to be low carbon, it's going to be cheap, it's going to give us energy security, we're no longer be relying on, I can't remember the exact phrases they use, but sort of despot governments or whatever holding us to ransom over energy. I mean, this is an absolute load of rubbish, and it's really appalling that you never really see journalists pick apart some of these just big statements that are thrown out. And partly one reason why I say it's because very few people actually talk about uranium, where uranium comes from, how we get uranium, and the cost of that, both in terms of environmental costs of uranium mining and also social costs around that as well. So I think there's many reasons to oppose nuclear, but I coming back to that point at the beginning about looking what nuclear is for. And I think, having been involved in climate campaigning for a number of years now, particularly energy transition discussions, we probably saw a big ramp up at this at the climate talks in Glasgow in 2020. If anybody was up in Glasgow at the time, there was nuclear plastered all over the place. And since then, in 2023, at the COP, there was an agreement. It's the first time that nuclear actually got mentioned as part of the COP agreement of being critical to the energy mix. And I think this is really disturbing because it is actually going to detract us away from the things that we do need to be investing in, and places where money can certainly be better invested, and obviously things that Fuel Poverty Action have been campaigning on for many years, and basic things like retrofit and insulation of homes and stuff like this. So on the cost level, I fail to see how this can be included as part of any affordable energy. And yes, it's called clean energy because obviously it's not fossil fuels, but it's not renewable energy. It is still relying on a finite resource. And of course, it has got huge legacy costs in terms of the waste. And we still haven't dealt with the legacy waste since the first nuclear reactors were produced, and all the military waste and the medical waste as well that is related to the nuclear industry. But I think one thing we do also have to be clear about, and this is the other disturbing thing about this, is that small modular reactors are not small. They keep, I saw an article in the Independent, it's like, we just have to think of them as like a couple of double-decker buses on top of each other. That is not what small modular reactors are. I mean, it was quite stunning. They do have waste, and there have been reports that they actually give out more radiation. The waste is harder to deal with. There are no designs yet for small modular reactors. So again, this idea that we're going to have these things come on stream by the mid-2030s, again, is risible, but the government is putting seed investment and money into that as well, which again is detracting away from the things which we need to be investing in for energy. But I think just to perhaps wrap up a bit, the other thing we have to be really clear about, and particularly the times that we're living in, there has always been a crossover between nuclear power and military uses, so the civilian and the defence sector. And I think Lee has put some of the links, some really good articles and reports, and the hard work done by Andy, Phil Johnson and Andy Sterling a couple of years ago, really digging down into why the Labour Party changed its policy in the 1990s, because they did a big U-turn. And at some stage, they were not supporting nuclear, and the Sustainable Development Commission under the Labour Party saw no role for nuclear in the energy mix as well. So there was a very big change, and I think they've really got to the crux of what we've always suspected is because of those crossover links between the two, and this is exactly what we're seeing now, and it is actually much more upfront in talking about the cross-fertilization between skills and jobs in the defence and civilian sectors. And I just say finally, and I'm sure we can come back to some of these things in discussion about the jobs aspect. Of course, anything, there will be jobs. You can talk about numbers of jobs or whatever. I think these start to become sort of almost pointless debates to some extent, but you have to look at the nature of those jobs, and how we could have jobs better distributed through other things, or reinvesting those skills and training into other things. So yes, anything will create some jobs. How many, we can get into numbers, but is that the right investment? No, not at all. And I just sorry, the one thing I did actually want to just close on as well, because I think nuclear has a long history, so we have got lessons to learn from that. But for those of you who remember when Tony Benn was actually energy minister, there's one thing he said when he left office, that in 1955, when Eisenhower said he was going for atoms for peace, I became a passionate supporter of it. I advocated it as a Minister of Technology. I was told and believed that nuclear power was cheap and safe and peaceful. He said, having been in charge of nuclear power, I discovered it wasn't cheap, it wasn't safe. And when I left office, I was told that during my period as Secretary of State for Energy, Plutonium from our nuclear power stations went to the Pentagon to make nuclear weapons. So every nuclear power station in Britain is a bomb factory for America. I was utterly shaken by that. Nothing in the world would now induce me to support nuclear power. It was a mistake. And I think, we have to remember those words, and that's where we are today. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Sam. Yeah, just agree with all that you said. I'll just add that the regulated asset-based model was called in America more descriptively early cost recovery, and the data on that is it left public authorities and people with massive debts that because it was a massive shit show. Sorry, excuse my language. The other thing I'd say is the government's dropped saying it's cheap. They say everything else about nuclear, but they don't say cheap anymore. If you go onto they say it's efficient, it's energy secure, all business, but they've kind of quietly dropped the cheap bit. It's clearly stupid. The other thing I would add is advanced modular reactors and small modular reactors. I've spoken to older nuclear engineers, and they have said these are PowerPoints and divorced from reality, especially the advanced modular reactors. And the problem, if you look across the pond at what's going on in America at the moment, they're deconstructing the whole of a very poor regulation regime with Elon Musk and his little 20-year-old fascist. And so you're going to trust what are Silicon Valley kind of connected nuclear startups that nuclear engineers here don't are kind of very wary of. And there is a distinction between small modular reactors and advanced modular reactors. The small modular reactors are kind of older technologies, just kind of smaller. But again, there is evidence that they may create more waste. They may be more fissile, etc. So it's not a good it's not a good for me, it's a junk technology that needs to be put to bed. So yeah, thank you, Stan. We'll move on now. Sorry, I'll stop rambling. Move on to Sally, uh, who's from Biofuel Watch, a long-time ally of Fuel Poverty Action and campaigns against large-scale industrial bioenergy, its impact on climate and nature and land, human rights, breaches of public health, public health dangers. So thank you. Go ahead, Sally.
Thank you so much, Lee, and thank you, Amal, for sharing the slides. As Lee was saying, I'm a campaigner with Biofuel Watch. I'm also a member of the Stop Burning Trees Coalition. And this is just the next slide. Together, we are trying to protect forests around the world that are being cut down for another industry that the government is funding. And this is called the biomass industry. And this is just the next slide. According to the biomass industry, burning wood in power stations for energy is a green, renewable, and carbon neutral alternative to fossil fuels. And the UK government is heavily invested in this industry. The UK is the top subsidizer of the biomass industry in Europe. But what's actually happening is that beautiful forests like the one on the left are being cut down, turned into these small wood pellets, and then shipped across the ocean to burn in UK power stations. And in particular, one of the biggest power station that is burning wood is called Drax Power Station, and Andrew mentioned it. Drax is in Yorkshire and it was built as a coal power station, but it now almost exclusively burns wood. Drax is actually the UK's single largest carbon emitter, and it is also the biggest burner of wood in the entire world, as well as the world's second largest producer of wood pellets. And the vast majority of wood that Drax is burning comes from clear-felled forests in the southern USA, Canada, Estonia, and Latvia. And in particular, Drax is burning wood from the southeastern USA. And this is just the next slide. Drax actually emitted 11 million tons of carbon dioxide in 2023 from its wood burning, and much of the wood is coming from these incredible forests in the southern USA. This area has been designated as a global biodiversity hotspot. It's home to many rare and endangered species, but these beautiful forests are being clear-felled completely, and we can see on the next slide what's happening to them. Just the picture on the left, every single tree is being cut down, and this is a disaster not just for nature but also for people. The communities living near the wood pellet mills that supply wood to burn in Drax are suffering constant air, water, and noise pollution. People say they just cannot breathe because of the wood dust that is very toxic. It can cause heart disease, it can cause cancer. It's very, very dangerous for the communities. Drax has been accused of driving environmental racism in the southern USA after settling air pollution violation claims at its pellet mill in Louisiana. And the company has been fined multiple times for violating air pollution limits in the southern USA. Drax is also sourcing huge amounts of wood from British Columbia in Canada. And this is just the next slide. Again, the forests here are incredibly important for wildlife. They're home to many rare species, including threatened caribou. And we can see on the next slide what's happening to these beautiful forests. They are being completely clear-felled. And BBC Panorama has been doing very important investigations into Drax's logging and discovered that Drax is cutting down primary forests in British Columbia. These are natural forests that have never been cut before. And Panorama discovered that Drax was still burning rare forest wood in 2024. And then just a couple of weeks ago, BBC Panorama discovered that Drax was been misreporting its data about where it is sourcing wood, that it didn't report that it was actually getting wood from primary forests. And Drax has been breaching environmental laws at its pellet mills in Canada, as well as in the USA. And as well as getting wood from Canada and the southern USA, Drax is also burning wood from Europe. And Channel 4 News discovered that even supposedly protected forests are being cut down in Estonia. And these forests are home to many rare species like the flying squirrels in the middle. They're incredibly important for nature. As well as being a disaster for wildlife, this wood burning is terrible for the climate. Over 500 scientists wrote to President Biden and other world leaders in 2021, urging them to end subsidies for burning wood because of the terrible climate impact. And they said burning of wood will increase global warming for decades to centuries. That is true even when wood replaces coal, oil, or natural gas. And in 2023, the UK Climate Change Committee said that the sustained use of large-scale biomass generation is not compatible with the path to net zero. So what's fueling this industry? Well, it is subsidies from the UK government. These are subsidies that are coming from our energy bills. And this is just the next slide. Drax alone is receiving around £1.5 million every single day in renewable subsidies to burn trees. And this money is coming from an extra charge on our energy bills. And this is happening at a time when millions are suffering from fuel poverty. This money should be going to real climate options like wind power, solar power, retrofitting homes that could really help people, that could tackle the climate crisis and the cost of living crisis. And just last week, the government announced that it is planning to extend Drax's subsidies. So at the moment, Drax is due to stop getting subsidies in 2027, but sadly, the government is now planning to give an extension until 2031. And Michael Shanks, the energy minister, claimed last week that the new subsidies are value for money for bill payers, that they are 50% lower than what Drax is currently getting, and that 100% of the biomass will come from sustainable sources. So that's the government claim. The reality is on the next slide. The subsidies were due to end in 2027. Drax should be getting nothing after that. And the government is planning to grant massive new subsidies. So it is not good value for money at all. And Drax will be getting a fixed price, which will be about £155 for every megawatt hour it produces. That is a very, very high amount of money. It's not good value for bill payers. It's going to lead to billions more from our energy bills to allow Drax to keep polluting, burning trees, and producing climate-wrecking emissions. And there is absolutely no obligation for Drax to do any carbon capture. This is money to help them keep burning trees. And the so-called sustainability standards that are going to be enforced will do nothing to protect forests because it's a voluntary certification scheme that the industry has set up itself. There is no independent person actually regulating it, and it has done nothing to protect these primary forests in Canada and other forests that are incredibly important from nature. So the sustainability claims do not add up. And just the next slide, please. The good news is that this announcement by the government was not the final decision, and that by working together, we can take action to show solidarity with communities who are suffering from Drax's tree burning, and we can work together to try and stop these new subsidies. And the key thing is that we still have time to try and reverse this decision. So this is just the next slide. The announcement last week was not the final word. The government is going to need to introduce secondary legislation called a statutory instrument. We don't know when that is coming. It will be sometime in the next few months. And although it's almost certain to pass because the government has a big majority, there is a huge amount that MPs can do to try and speak out against it and oppose it. And some MPs last Monday were already asking quite searching questions and opposing the plans for the new subsidies, but we need many more MPs to take action and get involved, and we really need your help to contact as many MPs as we can. We have a new e-action that we can, and this is just coming up maybe in the next slides. Thank you. If we can get MPs to oppose these subsidies, we could instead use the money for genuine climate solutions like wind power, solar power, retrofitting homes, putting in proper insulation. This would protect forests around the world and wildlife. It would help communities. It would create new green jobs and support a just transition for workers. And it would tackle both the climate crisis and the cost of living crisis. So there are enormous benefits that we could use with this money instead of giving it to big polluters like Drax. And it would be amazing if you would like to contact your MP about it. We have this new e-action, which is just on the next slide. And we're asking as many people as possible to write to their MPs with the e-action and say they need to reconsider this decision. And I'll pop the link in the chat. And then if you would like to, it's even more effective if you would like to maybe phone your MP's office or ask for a meeting. And there are also other ways you can take action. And this is just the next slide. You can join demonstrations. We're going to be planning more with Biofuel Watch and Stop Burning Trees. Just last Friday for Valentine's Day, Stop Burning Trees had some amazing actions in London, Nottingham, Port of Tyne, and also in Leeds. And it was a Valentine's Day action to dump Drax and tell Ed Miliband to stop breaking our hearts and to end these subsidies. And Drax's AGM is coming up in April, so we will be planning lots of things for that as well. And please feel free, if you would like to get involved, you can email us at biofuelwatch@gmail.com, and we would love to be in touch with you. Massive thank you to Fuel Poverty Action for this incredible webinar, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sally. Very interesting. Agree with everything I just add. I think generally I did an internship for Community Energy England, and I think it doesn't really get considered. Biofuels is viewed very dimly just in general because it of all the problems associated with it. And I would add that like renewables, wind and solar take up a lot of land in comparison to nuclear. And this is one of the things nuclear go on about, nuclear enthusiasts always talk about. But biofuels take even more land that could be better used for growing stuff. You might have said that. So, yeah. Okay, so if I may, I would use the privilege of thingy to ask one question to all the things. Is that okay, Amal?
Yeah, go for it.
Right. So all these dodgy solutions for me are based on a belief that there is no alternative. The old Thatcher nonsense that this is what we've got, capitalist system that must grow and profits must go upward. And so, I mean, I was thinking about this a lot when I wrote my book that I put in the chat. It's incredibly expensive. If anyone wants a copy of it, I'll email them a free copy because I'd like people to read it. And I think Rootledge put an embargo on it. Anyway, I was thinking about this. Why nuclear? And it's because nuclear has always been a technology that was associated. It would prime economic growth. This was its purpose. It would make things grow. It would have energy to grow, and we'd always want to grow, and we'd always need more energy. And it's just this thing going upward and upward. And so for me, I'd like your positions on this. Do we need to keep growing and have more and more energy all the time, or is there an alternative to this? What's the alternative? And yeah. And are all these solutions based on this view that we must keep growing and energy is expanding, etc.? Is that clear? Do you understand the question? Say if you do. That's to all of you. Andrew, do you want
to me?
Start? Yeah. Okay. Good. Right. Go. So Andrew, then go in the order that you spoke.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Lee. Yeah, I think that's a really important question. Energy reduction is not talked about enough, and degrowth is not talked about enough. I mean, you'll be aware there's a whole area of economics developing called degrowth. But one of the problem, I think, the problem we have in the immediate is even more than that. That what we get is just the same old type of growth. This 2% GDP, 3% GDP, and the person who actually invented the GDP measure way back, Steve Kuznets, I think. George Monbiot actually said his name on Newsnight the other night, but I think it's Steve Kuznets. He actually said that, it's not a good measure of well-being. And what we actually need, sort of society-wise, is a measure of well-being. And I would say that actually there are some forms of growth which are good, but what we're presented with almost entirely are bad forms of growth. And you see that with Heathrow, with Rosebank, with CCS, with nuclear, with Drax and biomass. They're all bad forms of growth. And yeah, but we've all also mentioned in this debate the opportunity cost of not doing home insulation, retrofit, renewables, and so on. And that, potentially is a good form of growth, brings more well-being, and so on. It doesn't necessarily feed into that GDP thing. So those are the key things I'd say on that. Yeah, but more than that, we need to look at energy demand in the energy system as well, and how we use energy, and that's really important. And obviously, this whole thing, actually, just to touch on the AI thing, what we have there is another bubble, but it's a bubble that Trump said, oh, yeah, we could build 80 gas-fired power stations just to feed this AI bubble in the US. And then the Chinese come along with an algorithm which shows that, it was the US solution's total bloatware. So we much more creative and not believe that we need these things which are put out there, say, by capitalism, just trying to keep itself going. I mean, I'd see AI and the open AI thing in the States as really the sort of, the death throes of capitalism, a really, really bad model. And it's been shown to be that. So energy reduction's hugely important. I'll stop there. Over to you, Sam, I think.
Yeah, Sam, next.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I agree with all that. I think it's always one of the problems, and I think, I touched on a bit in my contribution earlier. It's, what do we need energy for, and who is it for? And, part of my work over the years has been working with an organisation or initiative called Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, which came out of a group in New York, formed in 2012, under the basis of reclaim, resist, restructure, because I didn't see any progress being made within the climate talks and energy transition. But I think this is about, reclaiming energy into public ownership, resisting the fossil fuel agenda and the capitalist agenda, and restructuring it for public good, and in a way where energy isn't a commodity. And so we've always looked at energy as part of a system. And this is the debates which we had over the years in the trade unions. I mean, coming, where I did work at a, public sector trade union, it's like, well, what's energy got to do with you? But we coined the term, which we actually, nicked off the International Transport Workers Federation, is that actually we're all energy unions, we're all energy workers. Energy is to do with everybody, and it should be much more of a public debate. And this sort of idea that we're not allowed to talk about it from a trade union perspective if we don't have members in the industry is a nonsense, because it's like saying we can't talk about education policy, or we can't talk about welfare policy. It's not the preserve. I mean, obviously that's not to say that you want to go in and talk about how unions deal with their individual members and stuff, or negotiating in there. But and I think this is the problem. It gets driven by these technologies where there's very little public debate about it. And I just see this now right across the board with nuclear. We're just told we need nuclear. Why? Why do we need nuclear? We are actually doing quite well with it declining. And part of the problem is because we don't have this coordinated real proper coordinated proposal on energy, which links into transport, which links into agriculture, which links into all the things, and Sally, you were talking about ensuring the preservation of, our woodlands and stuff like this and biodiversity. And that's the problem, because who uses the most energy? It's not most of us sitting here, is it? It's, where's this energy going? And I think that whole thing around AI, and that's really interesting. And I think good point what you said, Andrew, is an absolute misnomer. I mean, part of the government's AI strategy document is creating these zones of AI areas, which you can just see they're going to link into the small modular reactors and all the rest of it. And when you think you've got in the US reopening 3 Mile Island, which was, the biggest nuclear accident, because the likes of, the Googles and the Microsofts and all the rest of it are just power hungry when, you've got people that can't afford to heat their homes and cook. This is just a nonsense. So so sort of long rambling way to say totally agree. And I think that's what we need to go back to looking, what is energy for, why do we have it, and who needs it, and how we should prioritize it. And these are obviously root things within fuel poverty action, and great discussions and debates that have been taking place over a number of years within FPA. Thanks. Over to Sally.
Well, thank you so much. I agree with everything that's been said. Great answers. I think with the biomass industry, one of the incentives behind it is what Andrew mentioned, that it's keeping the fossil fuel industry going. Power stations like Drax are coal power stations. And instead of, when the government was planning to phase out coal, these power stations didn't want to close down, and they discovered they didn't have to change the infrastructure inside the power station too much to switch from burning coal to burning wood. So it's very much about keeping these big polluters operating, and Drax has an enormous appetite. It's trying to expand. It's taken over a Canadian wood pellet company, so it's now producing its own pellets. It's shipping them to Asia, particularly to Japan, and it's trying to grow its business all over the world, including in America. Drax is also proposing to power AI data centers in America. And there just aren't enough trees in the world to satisfy Drax's appetite. And by burning trees, they're destroying the vital carbon sinks that we need if we are to avoid the worst impacts of climate breakdown. So if we want to have growth, the best growth is about protecting our ecosystems, reviving nature, restoring these vital habitats that protect nature and protect humans. That's what we really need to be growing. And absolutely investing in real climate solutions, massively expanding wind, solar power, and retrofitting homes. It would make such a difference. It would tackle fuel poverty. It would create so many jobs. And Stop Burning Trees recently published a report called Beyond Drax about different alternatives for real low carbon green jobs for Yorkshire, that we don't need these massive polluters that are destroying the planet. We can invest in green energy instead that will actually help people and help tackle the climate crisis.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would just add that, yeah, I've said this before on this forum, that AI and nuclear are solutions looking for problems, and then they're meeting together, and we're us allowing that to happen is we're all going to get killed by killer robots in the end. So let's stop it. The other thing I'd say is we already have carbon capture and storage and production. They're called trees. Right. So on that note, we're going to open it to the floor. We've got hands up. Do you want to come in, Mal, and pick people, or am I doing this still?
Yeah, no, please carry on. You're doing a great job.
Okay. So Ken was first on, very quick. I think Ken was first. I can't see everyone, so maybe if you could keep an eye on people putting their hands up. But Ken, go ahead, please.
Can I stick my hand up? I'm on the phone, so I haven't got any chat to put in.
Who's speaking there? Sorry. Who? Wait. So that's. I don't know who this is, but go.
Oh, me now. You mean? Yes?
I
I
stopped,
was just,
Ken and I stopped speaking because I heard the phone user.
who do you want to go?
I think let's go with Ken, who had his hand up first, and then we'll have whoever's calling. Sorry, I can't see your name.
Steve.
Steve. Hi, Steve. Thank you for joining us. Let's have Ken and then Steve.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Right. That was really interesting, but it was a bit of a sell and sort of thing you might expect from a timeshare salesman selling one particular issue, but not answering some questions that were in my mind the whole time. For example, all the speakers failed to deal with one of the big thorny problems of wind and solar being intermittent. So when the wind doesn't blow and there isn't the sunshine, you need something else. And that has been a problem that is right now, isn't it? Having some storage mechanisms is part of the green solution to me, and that's a difficult part of the green solution. The sort of questions that were in my mind that people would throw back at you is when Germany made its decision to end nuclear power and move to fossil fuels, it was a disaster, wasn't it, for their carbon footprint? How come electricity in France, which is mostly coming from nuclear, is significantly cheaper than in Britain? How come, for example, nuclear submariners who rely on these small-scale nuclear power plants actually have less radiation on average than the general population? Because they're under the sea, but also it's a relatively low radiation where they're living in the submarine. So there's no set truth that there must be dangerous radiation. Over twice as much energy comes out of the gas grid compared with the electricity grid. So it's not a trivial matter to swap over either. I think there was a tendency to confuse the technologies with the way it's being used by our system, and our system messes up everything. It's even messing up the cabling across the country coming from the new wind turbines. So it was those sort of things I was looking for, and therefore there's a bit of a disappointment in not hearing those answers to those questions, which many people in the general population would ask. I'm the secretary of a trade union council. We have three big themes that we're pushing on: climate justice, health justice, and worker justice. And so I am very favourable to what you're saying in general. But we do need a solid argument which will convince large amounts of people, including the 20,000 members in our Trades Council.
Okay, that was a lot. That was a lot of questions. So I will just answer a bit on France. France gets its uranium from its colony, from neo-colonialism across Africa. So it's not a good system to be extracting uranium in very dodgy conditions across the African continent. You'll notice they've been booted out of most of those places very recently, and so their supply of uranium is going to be a problem going forward. Intermittency is an issue, but yeah, I mean, other people can answer the questions now if they can remember them. But I was just going to say that on France. Anyone want to come in?
Well, I'm just going to say, do you want to take a few speakers' contributions, perhaps?
He asked a lot of questions there, so I think maybe address and they're going to be, I think they were quite important questions, so I think we go through this one as quickly as we can.
Okay.
Are you going, Sam?
Oh, go ahead, Andrew. It's fine.
I'm happy to go ahead on the energy storage and intermittency issue. I mean, I only touched on it, Ken, but I have thought about this a lot actually, and it's sort of implicit in my presentation. Despite what I've said about growth and degrowth, if you just work off the government figures in their clean energy plan, their 2030, and also which is based on the NESO Clean Power 2030 report, which came out earlier. I studied those in detail, and essentially everything goes according to those plans, and there's a lot of obstacles we can come on to, we should be left with about 5% of energy having to come from gas at 2030. And that's basically how they define clean energy 2030, that there's 5% of gas left in the system. But what that report did show, as far as CCUS, both hydrogen and gas CCS, was up to 2030, you didn't need it. They actually have one pathway which blows out renewables and offshore wind at 50 gigawatts out in the North Sea. And I can't remember how much solar, something like 27 gigawatts, I think. And if you get to those levels in the next 5 years, then at 2030, you don't need any gas CCS or blue hydrogen. Then comes the question, well, why might you need it in the future either? If you can get to 2030 without it, why bother with it at all? Because it's meant to be a transition fuel, a transition energy. So, yes, there is an intermittency problem, but what the NESO report and the government's report shows is that you can solve it up to 5%. 95% you can solve it. There may be 5% of the time when you need gas and so on. And they're also talking about dispatchable power coming in for a certain amount of that. But the problem with all these technologies we're talking about today, CCS, nuclear, and biomass and BECCS, is that they're basically all bad technologies and all expensive, but they also lock you in. I mean, if someone builds a gas-fired power plant with CCS delivers it in 2030, they're not going to want to switch it off before 2060. So the thing is locked in to drawing gas, probably from LNG, from Donald Trump's Texas gas fields being fracked and so on. It's going to draw that gas across to the UK for many years to come, and that's exactly what we don't want to do. We don't want that lock-in to fossil fuels, and that's the main argument against it. And it applies on all of these technologies. They lock us into bad, very costly technologies, which cost the consumers and the taxpayer. And all the speakers have been unanimous on that there's an opportunity cost with investing in any of these and putting these massive billions of pounds of subsidies into them, in that, retrofit, home insulation, and solar and wind and storage solutions are just not getting the funding. I put some figures in the
Right,
chat.
I'm going to have to stop. If I can stop you there, Andrew, because we need to move on. Just bring in.
Chat. Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you. Bring in. Sorry, is it?
Steve? Are you trying to bring in Steve, Lee?
No, Sally. If she doesn't want to, one of the speakers.
Yeah, we absolutely agree with Andrew that and what Ken was saying about battery storage, that definitely needs a lot more investment so that you can store the power from wind and solar. And in 2023, Oxford University did a study that found we would have enough wind and solar power if we improve battery storage. I'll just pop the link in the chat.
Yeah, can I just quickly add, as well? I mean, just because there were specific questions on nuclear. I mean, this is a perennial question that's always asked about baseload power, intermittency, etc. And look, of course, there's thousands of workers in the industry. Nobody disrespects that at all. And like anything with the energy transition, this is also part of a just transition question. But the industry has been winding down. As I said earlier, we could be out of nuclear by around the mid-2030s now. And in fact, workers are at a huge risk now with extending the life of plants. And I've been quite shocked at some trade unions supporting that, even when there's clear health and safety risks as well. But I think going back to what I said earlier about the switch in Labour Party policy when they were previously in power, the Sustainable Development Commission said then, I mean, echoing really a lot of the points that Andrew already made around technology lock-in, distraction of investment in renewable energy and energy efficiency measures, cost, intergenerational legacy, waste, safety, increased risk of nuclear weapon proliferation. And none of those things have changed at all. And there's loads and loads and loads of work that will need to take place in decommissioning that is even happening now. So the kind of work question and those skills do not go away. They will be needed into the future because we've got such a horrendous nuclear legacy as well. And it does distract us from building the system that we need based on renewables and obviously improved battery storage, etc. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. I think we should move on. Thank you. Thank you there, Sam. So who was it? Was it the anonymous person on the phone next? Can you hear me?
Yeah. It's Steve from Rising Tide. Yeah, it's not. I just wanted to make a few quick points about nuclear. So it's not just extending the lifetime of existing reactors or site planning legislation being cut and environmental impact assessments may no longer be necessary if the infrastructure bill goes through as is. But it's also the approval process for new designs and the safety of them. That's been cut by literally years, from a 5-year process to a 3-year fast-track process, which doesn't say much for safety. On their size, there's nowhere in the world where anybody is thinking of building so-called small modular reactors who isn't considering, or citing them, considering putting two together. There's not going to be one on its own anywhere. They're like twin buildings, and 2 of those are bigger than the area that Bradwell currently occupies. So they're anything but small. On the CO2 impact, there's a very old article on the Rising Tide website in the resources section that lists all the CO2 impacts that the industry, the sector, doesn't count. And one of those, of course, is uranium extraction, processing, and transport. There's virtually no data on the CO2 impacts of that. There's one study from Australia from the 1980s. There's virtually nothing else because it's in their interest to keep it quiet. But to sell the idea of new nuclear on this energy self-sufficiency malarkey is obviously complete nonsense, because there isn't any uranium that we use in the UK. It mostly comes from either countries like South Africa and Australia, where they're now having to crush huge amounts of rock to get a smaller and smaller amount of uranium out, so the processing costs have rocketed. Or it's in places like Kazakhstan or Mali, so it's not exactly energy security. In fact, the Mali operation that's run by EDF, which is a French state company, which is why their electricity in France is cheap, is because the government intervened after the pandemic and made it even cheaper than it already was, because it's subsidised. There's a French Foreign Legion unit permanently based at the Mali uranium site, just to keep it going, because they know they've already fought off one coup. So it's anything but self-sufficiency for energy. And of course, the other thing that new nuclear reactors and old ones need is water, and they share that with these new data centres in terms of resources. They need vast amounts of water for cooling.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Steve. Was it like, yeah, all, what was I going to say? That, well, we'll move on. So thanks for that. Very interesting. Edward, next, please.
Hi, sorry, just unmuting. Hi. I think we had a question about whether there has been any research into lobbying and how this is affecting these decisions, particularly with the UK government, because I think it's kind of confusing, for example, with Drax, how they would make a decision like that when there's quite a lot of evidence against it. When, yeah, I wonder, like, what's the benefit for them and what studies are there about, you know, how much lobbying is impacting decisions like this, and whether there's any kind of counter lobby going on. Yeah.
Yeah. So I say for nuclear, the nuclear engineers and scientists are a big group that shill for nuclear. Also, the Ministry of Defence is pretty keen on nuclear, and all the defence type people. So yeah, that's the lobby there. I'll pass on to anyone else who wants.
I could maybe say something about lobbying. You're absolutely right. It's an incredibly important factor when it comes to Drax. Drax has a large lobbying budget and has given significant donations to Labour in the past. And Drax has also sponsored events at Labour Party conferences. I was at the UK Labour conference in Liverpool last year, and Drax wasn't overtly there, but they were present as part of the Carbon Capture and Storage Association, and we noticed there was a huge presence from carbon capture groups. So we're finding that some of the big polluters, like the big fossil fuel companies and companies like Drax, are no longer obviously at these conferences, but they're there through groups like Offshore Energies UK or Energy UK and the Carbon Capture and Storage Association. And hydrogen was also a very prominent feature at the Labour conference. Ed Miliband did have a meeting with the CEO of Drax. We haven't seen the minutes of that yet. We've put in a freedom of information request. I think he met in the summer, so soon after Labour came to power, and we're trying to find out what was discussed. But it is a massive factor.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
I can come in on the CCS very quickly. I've already put a link in DSMOG article about just before the government made that £22 billion pledge in October. There's significant record of government in the lobbying by people like the CCS Association and so on. I also think a lot of lobbying goes on at the COPs, where of course Miliband and Starmer and everybody went both last year and the previous year before they got into government. And the COPs had sort of 3,000 fossil fuel lobbyists and 500 for CCS, for example. So yeah, there's a huge amount of lobbying. I've also put in just on whether there's, you know, scientists and so on lobbying against it. Yes, we've written 2 letters to Miliband, and I put those in the chat as well. They only got answered just last week by Sarah Jones, a minister under Miliband, and she basically ducked all the issues about upstream emissions and methane emissions, which are the significant points. That's me. If Sam wants to come in.
Okay, I was going to say we'll go on to the next question, Sam, and you can start. You can answer first if that's okay with you, Sam.
Yeah, that's good. It's fine.
All right. So Steve Harper.
Thank you. Yes, I was listening for my name there, but when you said Harper, I realised who it was. That's good. Thank you. Yeah, I think the military aspect of wanting to have nuclear power stations is a bit of an incorrect driver. It's just smoke and mirrors, really. They have massive storage of highly enriched uranium. I think a proportion of that came from the reprocessing of materials that we were bringing into UK, reprocessing and so on, that was sent in from around the world. But there's I think it's more than enough, more than enough highly enriched uranium to make enough warheads than we'll ever need, That's just a non-point again, in terms of trying to bolster the idea of the need of having nuclear power stations. I would imagine the top brass in the army are probably pretty well lobbied by the nuclear industry again itself, It's the small modular thing is a joke. Like I was watching a whole thread once, and basically as a move forwards, it was kind of they were trying to get towards like a point of a design that they could then get referenced and get authorized and get an approved design. But I joked that they've only got as far as moving from CGIs to animated CGIs. That's as far as they've got. And it really is that bad. I mean, one of the flaws. I mean, I could talk of this for length, but this is something that applies to construction industry as well. But the large highly valuable projects that we do in the UK that we completely mess up. They run way over time, apart from road building, which quite often is quite constrained in terms of what it achieves. But generally, they run way over time and they run way over cost. One of the primary reasons for this, in my mind, is that the design is not well enough developed. So they're trying to do a budget or a cost or a lump sum cost for the whole thing over a period of 20 years plus, whenever they haven't even got a fully, reasonably detailed design. And the more accurate the design is, the more accurate the pricing is. And that's a fundamental flaw in what we do in UK and the way we do it. The other thing to bear in mind is that it's also private equity that puts money in behind these things because they want these massive sort of large scale projects because of this amount of revenue that goes through. And you might say that, well, if you own EDF, you're not exactly printing money. But the people that lend EDF money to do what they do, are the people that are skimming off all the money and making all the massive profits. So the banking system and the financial services system does directly target and fund. And in some cases, like with HS2, I would go so far as to suggest that they actually came up with the idea in the first place, yeah. And HS1, because they wanted to invest those large amounts of revenue to make lots of money back.
Yeah, agree. Just point out that the argument is not that we need civil and military for nuclear bombs. It's that the expertise is the same. The actual every reactor built is dual purpose. It creates energy and creates explosive material. And so the interdependency goes across the whole set. That's the argument, not that it's about building nuclear weapons.
Indeed, but we only make the warheads for the missiles, which we do make at Aldermaston, although the Americans own big chunks of that as well. The people that are in there at Aldermaston and so on are Halliburton and all these other American companies. You'd recognize all the names, and those are the people that own big chunks of what we do at Aldermaston, although ostensibly we make our own nuclear warheads. But the materials we need for that, as I said when I started, those already exist in UK. We have more of the materials we need to make those weapons than we will ever need.
Okay, we're going to have to move on, but thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
All right, Ruth. Sorry, wait. Do you want to say anything? Sorry, Ruth. Sam, did you want to come in? Sorry, I said that you could speak first there. And I started waffling myself.
No, that's fine. I'll just make one point. I mean, I think you kind of addressed it, Lee, anyway, but we have to look at, say, for example, there's a £9 billion contract that's just been awarded to Rolls-Royce, who are making the reactors for the submarines in Derby, and that's all part of the ACOS project with the US and Australia. So, and I think, as Lee said, this is the issue about where cross-fertilization comes in. And if you read the documentation, it's clear. I mean, it's not just in the UK, even in the US. They've been very explicit in the past few years about the crossover between nuclear, civilian and defence nuclear skills. And that's why they want to keep them in there, because it takes a long time for some of the military projects to come on. So we need to keep those skills going in their view within the civilian side. So, and it's interesting as well because it's one of the few areas where trade unions have had a seat within the nuclear industry, where trade unions are shut out pretty much everywhere else. But it's quite, and if you want to talk about lobbying, that's one of the strong areas of lobbying as well, and revolving doors of, Tom Greattrix, who's the head of the UK Nuclear Energy Association, I think it is, used to work for the GMB, used to be a Labour MP, and we quite often see that revolving doors around these people in the industry. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Ruth.
Yeah, I wanted to go back a few steps to the issue of batteries, because they came up quite a few times, and there's kind of an assumption that developing batteries is on the side of the angels, which I mean, I think people know about where the lithium comes from, the possibility of maybe moving towards sodium or better solutions than lithium. But in any case, there is a question of a prospect of the countryside being covered by huge battery farms, where they look to store the energy that is being produced that is too much when the wind blows. And it's now companies being paid huge sums to turn off the wind turbines. The curtailment costs are enormous. The cost of the batteries would be enormous, and the loss to the countryside, economically and just visually, and in terms of people's living habitat, could be enormous. And in Fuel Poverty Action, we've been looking at what can be done in terms of taking that free energy and actually making sure it gets to the people who need free energy. And some of it does actually get directly to consumers now, but they tend to be people who own EVs and people with space for a very large battery on their own estate, rather than the people who are in fuel poverty and need it. And that could take some of that excess free energy and make a positive of it rather than a negative. Of course, it's not, there's discrepancies with timing, and it doesn't necessarily happen when you need it. And there will need to be storage, but instead of batteries, there can also be things like hot water tanks that they're actually pulling out of people's homes as we speak, but which are a very good way of storing heat. And as Steve mentioned, district heating, which, I mean, people might know that we in FPA have done a lot of work on district heating, and the way it's run is appalling, but it does have a huge potential in terms of actually making communal storage of energy that doesn't require batteries, and might not be as profitable, so might not be as good for growth, but would be a lot better for people's health and growing children.
Yes. Yeah, the hard agree there is this is for me, just to say briefly, that is the problem with all these technologies are being positive because they're profitable. It's not about cost, it's about profits. And renewables generally have 5%-ish profit margin. Fossil fuels about 15%. And so waiting for the market to do it is not going to work. The communities and the state have to do this work, otherwise it ain't going to happen. Is anyone else? Any other questions or comments? I can't. Can you see anyone? Yeah, Amal, go. Floor is yours.
Hey, thank you. I've seen like a lot of back and forth or a lot of conversation like in the news about hydrogen. There seems to be a lot of back and forth on like what it could be used for. And I thought this might be a good space. I know there's a lot of sort of a lot of knowledge altogether here. I'm wondering, yeah, if we can sort of cut through what's being said in the media, in terms of sort of what is the potential for hydrogen? Is it realistic, to use hydrogen to heat people's homes? That seems to have been in the conversation. Like, will like net zero Teesside produce hydrogen, or like could that produce hydrogen to heat people's homes, for example? Is that something they're actually thinking about? Yeah.
I'd say no and no, short answer, but I'll leave it to Andrew to fill in the details.
Yeah, I come in a bit on that. I think the thing about the need for hydrogen, there's a hydrogen ladder produced by Michael Lebrecht, and that's worth looking at. And it goes basically, it lists, I don't know, about 50 possible applications which have been put out there for hydrogen. And the vast majority of them, are either sort of really expensive or it doesn't really work very well. I mean, the example you give about heating homes, that's just another way of keeping the fossil fuel industry going, because that was putting a small amount of hydrogen into the gas network, and they tested it in a couple of places. But actually, there's huge amounts of research that's come out to showing that basically isn't a good idea, even on the energy basis, let alone the climate basis, that it would just keep the gas network going. It would keep people having gas boilers in their homes and so on. there might be some usages, I think, in transport, like for decarbonising HGVs, where possibly it might be difficult to do with batteries. Um, but when you look at it, the amount of hydrogen they're talking about producing is just hugely much more than the possible applications. So what I think we need to do is really just wait on this, because we don't know what this hydrogen market is. There's a big bubble there. Wait and see if we can produce what we need through green hydrogen, which is electrolysis. And that actually would use some of that excess energy Ruth was talking about, coming off, wind turbines when the grid is full to capacity anyway. You could capture that with electrolysis, because hydrogen at the end of the day is only a storage medium. It's not actually a source of energy. So you're storing the energy to use it somewhere else. And of course, storing energy is inefficient. So, I mean, if you can actually drive the thing directly from the wind energy or whatever, that's better than storing it as hydrogen. But there may be a usage where it's worth storing it as hydrogen if it's green hydrogen. But the blue hydrogen thing, I think, is totally discredited because of the high upstream methane emissions. They're never going to get rid of those. You can never capture those methane emissions. Over in Texas or whatever, the methane's always going to leak, and blue hydrogen's basically a no-no because of that. But to answer your question, Amal, yes, they are planning to do it in Teesside, not as net zero Teesside itself, but the next follow-on plant, which is actually, I was in Teesside last week looking at this, the follow-on plant is next door to where the gas-fired power station would be, and it would be a blue hydrogen plant, producing massive amounts of blue hydrogen, but we don't know what to do with it. I know we're running out of time, just to say one possible use they're talking about is also mixing it with gas-fired power stations. So you take natural gas, you generate hydrogen, you've already lost a lot of energy and you've created a lot of methane emissions doing that. Then you store it and then you put it into a gas-fired power station in a mix. And they're planning on doing that in Humberside now. They've just brought forward the planning on one of those. It's hugely inefficient because you've got 3 steps before the hydrogen even gets in to the gas-fired power station to then be part of generating the electricity. And when I looked at the planning for that, they actually put scenarios in from 100% natural gas, in other words, what we burn now in a gas-fired power station, through to 100% hydrogen. And it's quite clear that they intend to go on using gas in the mix for many, many years, because they wouldn't have those scenarios in the sort of prototype environmental impact assessment unless they needed them. So, yeah, the whole hydrogen thing at the moment is sort of overhyped. And we really just need to look at where there are unique niches for it, perhaps, and basically just not consider the rest of them because they're not going to be helpful to us. And I believe we can do those unique niches on green hydrogen generated from electrolysis.
Okay, thank you. Bring in Michael. Last question, I believe, because we've run out of time.
I do appreciate we're already over time, and indeed, Andrew has stolen much of my thunder there anyway. So I endorse almost everything he says. Blue hydrogen, absolute no-no. But the one thing which we haven't focused enough on is we need timely solutions. It's not ideal, optimal solutions. It's solutions that we can get in place at scale quickly. Otherwise, we miss all of our targets. That's why we automatically, at a stroke, ignore nuclear. It's irrelevant. But I would argue it's also the reason we have to look very cautiously at green hydrogen, because I would argue that every kilowatt hour that is diverted to that function is a kilowatt hour taken away from the electrification of heat and power. It will slow decarbonisation. Although we have to accept it's very difficult at the moment to come up with other means of long-term storage. And we should not kid ourselves. We do need critically need a solution for the long-term storage of electricity.
Because
Well,
briefly
thank
comment
you,
there,
Michael.
sort of,
Go ahead quickly.
yeah, I sort of agree about green hydrogen, and also the electrolyzers are very expensive at the moment, and so on. I mean, I would prefer to see us looking at long duration storage, and obviously there's pumped hydro, which you can do in Scotland and places like that, and also things like liquid compressed air, and they're developing that in Manchester, Highview Power. That's compressing air into a liquid and the low pressure, and then you let it come out at high pressure, drives turbines later. And we need that sort of long duration storage as a balancer on the grid. So I agree, Michael. I'd far rather see money put into that than hydrogen, because hydrogen's only turning one sort of energy into another ultimately.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you to all the speakers. Very interesting. And okay, just I don't know whether you want to say anything, Amal, before we close out the session, because we have just gone over time. Or Ruth, as one of the yeah, if you want to come in and say something.
No, all I wanted to say was don't forget Andrew's court case.
Oh yeah, yeah,
You want to give the
yeah,
details again, Andrew?
Thank you
yeah.
very
Put it in the
much.
chat
Yeah.
and go through it again.
Yeah, that's March the 4th. If you want to come into the hearing, then sort of you turn up about 9:45. Don't know what the court number will be and all that stuff, but we will. I'll try to get that out on all the networks ahead of that. But the main thing is the rally, and we're going to hopefully bring together a lot of people on climate and energy issues. I'm hoping that it's sort of bringing lots of different voices together. And actually, I sort of don't want 10 people just saying CCS is a bad idea. I want 10 people saying what's better ideas and their take on energy for the speakers. So that's 12:30 for 1 o'clock.
And hopefully there must be a role for people online as well in
Well,
tweeting.
I'm trying to get someone to stream it, the live streaming. But what other roles might there be online for
Well,
that?
it could be like blue sky kind of social
Yes,
media
sure.
posts and stuff like
Yeah,
that. So if you can,
yeah.
yeah, if you can share that with Fuel Poverty Action, we'll promote it.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. We'll have a social media strategy. Now, thanks for helping me think of that. It's all being organized on the fly rather quickly. That's really helpful.
Okay, Amal, you want
Yeah, I think this is a great place to end. Thanks again, everyone, for coming. If you all want to just switch on your camera, wave goodbye, and say good evening as well, just for a sense of conviviality in the online space. Yeah, great to see everyone. Have a good evening.
Cheers,
Thank
it was
you
really
very
interesting.
much.
Thank you, everyone.
I had
Good to see
fun
you all.
Very
hosting. I hope it
interesting.
wasn't too bad.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye. Toodaloo.
Thank you.